Morning, everyone. I'm Carlin Bowman, and I'm a senior fellow here at AEI, senior fellow emeritus, I should say, at AEI, where I've been for many years studying public opinion. And I'd like to welcome all of you to this morning's session with Elliott Morris to discuss his new book, Strength in Numbers, How Polls Work and Why We Need Them, and to celebrate its publication, which I think happened yesterday. Elliott is the data journalist for The Economist, where he covers politics, elections, and public opinion. Elliott's book is timely and important. It's election season. Well, then again, it's always election season. And the polls will be under great scrutiny once again. As Elliott notes in the introductory chapter, if you have heard anything about the polls, you have probably heard about their failures in recent, especially 2016 and 2020 elections, and in not so recent elections. Elliott puts those failures into perspective, but he gives us much more. His is a deep and rich history of the business and an especially helpful discussion of some of the newer developments, including the uses and abuses of big data. Elliott concludes with a robust defense of the polls, and I'm quoting, quote, a necessary and empowering addition to the democratic experiment, a, quote, cracked mirror, but the best one we have. We're very fortunate to have a superb panel to discuss the cracked mirror. Their full bios are available on your website. Amy Walters of the Cook Political Report is one of the leading political commentators, and I should add, one of the most careful reporters of public opinion polling data around. I congratulate you today, Amy. Today is the 25th anniversary of the release of the Partisan Voting Index, something that all of us in politics use on a regular basis. I've admired Selinda Lake for a very, very long time. Selinda is the highly respected Democratic pollster who polled for President Biden in 2020 and many other Democratic candidates as well. And being in the business, she can provide an insider's perspective on concerns about the public part of the polling business. My AEI colleague, Dan Cox, will bring his deep understanding of how the polls work and what they tell us into this discussion. Dan is the founder of AEI's new Survey Center on American Life that's exploring a variety of public opinion topics in much greater depth than the media polls. I'm going to be the traffic cop today. Before telling you how we'll proceed this morning, let me mention that free copies of the book will be available for you after the event. And we want to hear from you. If you have questions for Elliott or for the panel, you can email beatrice.lee@aei.org or use the hashtag #StrengthInNumbers. Elliott's going to spend about 15 minutes introducing the book. Then we will turn to each of the panelists for commentary for 3 to 4 minutes. Then Elliott will give you a few minutes to respond. And finally, we're going to turn to your questions. Elliott, the stage is yours. There we go.
Well, thanks AEI for having me and everyone else for turning up. I did a launch event. The book came out yesterday at Politics and Prose, which had a bit fewer, I think, than the people here. So, I mean, it's a small space. It was crowded. But it's a good turnout. So I'm really happy that y'all are here. Instead of summarizing the book, because we're going to do a bit of that here and because I'm going to make you read it instead, I want to tell you two things. I want to tell you first why I wrote the book. I think it seems like a weird time to write a book about the science and art of polling, especially in here. Now you'll know what it looks like. Especially after the 2016 and 2020 elections, when we got headlines about polls having catastrophic errors or like failing or breaking or not being able to be reliable. There was a Slate article that said never trust polls again, which I think, for me as someone who's worked for a pollster, at least as an intern, as a methodology intern for the Pew Research Center, and as someone who consumes polls on a daily basis, is sort of like the worst case scenario to have people in major news organizations saying don't trust the polls. And we'll sort of explain why that's so damaging too. But so that's the mindset I had when I started writing this book. I wanted to write a defense. I wanted to write a corrective book that said, actually, these indicators are pretty good. I mean, if you look at the historical accuracy of the polls, this is what we do when we're creating election forecasting models. That's part of my work at The Economist as a data journalist. You'll find that, on average, going back to 1948, when we had the first so-called scientific polls, and I put in quotes on that, and we'll also define that later, or describe that later, the average error in predicting a Democrat share of the two-party presidential vote is like a percentage point and a half or 2 percentage points. Like from where I'm sitting, as someone who consumes polls to tell stories about the public, sometimes to forecast elections, 2 percentage points is actually pretty good. I mean, in a close election, right, 2 percentage points can be the whole ball game. But what I found when I'm reading the archives of like Public Opinion Quarterly and political science journals to try to understand polls better is that polls do something much more important than forecasting elections, and that's that they tell us, the people, all of us sitting in this room, what other people want from the government. And that's not just like percent support of legal abortion in most or all cases, or support welfare, or support what have you. It's also a really important signal to our leaders of what the people want them to focus on. So there's also an agenda-setting responsibility for the polls, which I think sort of most people, when they think about polls, don't think about that. But pollsters also ask stuff like, what's the most important problem today? What are you having trouble paying your bills? Are there areas of your social life that the public or that the government could focus on? And so it's that research into the polls that prompted me to write an entirely different book. Not a corrective, not a defense of election forecasting or of polls accuracy, which I think in hindsight could have just been a book chapter instead of a whole book anyway. But to write a book about the history, the very, very deep history of polls being intertwined in our democratic process and how they actually help people, and how I think if we view polls in that way, as something as tools for democracy, not just predicting elections or for covering the horse race or whatever, then we'll be better off. And that's not to say I'm never going to do that stuff again. We're doing it like right now. But to add those other contexts of what polls can do in the process. And I'll also note, like this is not an entirely new argument by no means, but to the extent that pollsters are making these arguments, I think people in the press, like myself, should also be making them if we believe in them, and I do. So that's why I wrote the book. And that's something you're not going to read in the book. There's no preface. That's not really anywhere online. That's just for people talking to me about the book. But I also want to give you something special. I want to give you a little story, something that's not in the book, facts and stories based information. And that is the story of how polls work under the hood, of the fundamental problem, I'll call it, with polls, not today, but all the time. Whenever you're taking a survey, this is the problem that pollsters will tell you they're trying to solve, that all of their statistical tools or whatever that they've invented to correct their samples. And it's an illustrative example that pollsters also use to describe their process very, very often, and what the mathematician Jordan Ellenberg calls the soup principle. So this is how polls are soup, how the process of tasting soup tells us how polls work. And so I'll start with a bowl of tomato soup first, and then I think I'm going to explain how maybe this example can be updated for the future, and certainly the present. So you're cooking a bowl of tomato soup. Pollsters will tell you that polling is essentially the same process as trying to taste this soup to make sure you've cooked it correctly. And this is like a direct example from pollsters, I'll say. If you're trying to figure out if you've salted or herbed or seasoned or added the right amount of cheese to this soup, you stir it together and you dip a spoon in and you taste the soup. So polls work in a similar process in that if everyone, is a big if, of course, if everyone is perfectly the same likelihood of answering your poll, then you're like casting a spoon into the American population and scooping up 1,000 of them, and you're not eating them, but asking them what they think. And that is an apt metaphor for polls if that big if condition is met, if everyone is equally likely to answer your survey in a perfect world. But we know, sitting here in 2022, that polls are not perfect, that this like soup tasting process, I think, needs updating. And one way to think about it is to use a different soup, a minestrone soup, which is not so homogeneous or not as homogeneous as a tomato soup, where most of the ingredients are really blended together, but that's like full of chunks of different ingredients, of pastas, of tomatoes. There's a cucumber in here, which is kind of weird, and other ingredients also. And if you're tasting minestrone soup, you don't just take one spoonful, because you might only get pasta, or you might only get cheese, or because it's a chunky soup, right? So we can think of the American population along similar lines, that we're not as homogeneous, I think, in our attitudes as the tomato soup, but that we exist as people with rather predictable attitudes based off of our demographic traits. So you can think of the pasta being white people, the cheese being non-college educated people, or what have you. And so when you're taking a poll in the modern day, you want to make sure you have equal proportions of all those people so that your poll reflects the population. So maybe if you're tasting your minestrone soup, you need a ladle or multiple spoonfuls to make sure your tasting is accurate. And this is where polls have trouble, is in getting the right proportions of everyone. That is the fundamental problem. So in 1948, when you have the first miss in scientific polls, arguably you have this miss because pollsters are undersampling, and this story is in the book, undersampling or having bad non-response issues among supporters of Franklin Roosevelt. Of Harry Truman. There's a 1936 in the example in the book too, and that issue is that the people in the poll are not representative. That's all pasta or whatever. So pollsters have statistical tricks to push their samples back toward the target distributions of the population, right? That you want X% of white and Y% of black and Z% of college-educated people or whatever. And we have those statistical tools now, but it's important that those tools only correct for things that pollsters directly program into their software. So if you're having too many Republicans or Democrats answer your poll, recently we've had too many Democrats answering polls, the Association of Public Opinion Research tells us, then you are going to have another error in your polling that you haven't accounted for. Maybe you forgot to scoop up one ingredient in your minestrone soup. And that fundamental problem, I mean, it's not an issue with polling that breaks polling. It's something that pollsters have to routinely address to fix their methods to create representative surveys. And that's what I want people to think about whenever they see a poll. I want them to sort of think through this process. Statisticians call it a data generating process, or a DGP. I'm not expecting everyone to use that terminology because it's horrible. But if you see a poll in the New York Times, think about whether or not it's taken the proper sampling of the soup. Think about whether they've adjusted for all the things that pollsters say they should be adjusting for. Don't consume the information naively, but think about basically the ways that this very artful process of science, a very uncertain scientific process, could break down. Not, break, but could become biased in unpredictable ways. And I think if we do that, this is what the book says, if we do that, then we come to polls with a renewed sense of uncertainty and with less expectations for perfect laser predictive accuracy, hyper-precise election forecasts, or what have you. And then we can use polls for their bigger purpose, which is helping democracy, elevating the voice of the people in Washington, where we are, in the halls of Capitol Hill, and also in the news business, and for anyone who is consuming polls. So those are two nuggets that aren't anywhere else that I wanted to share, and I think that the soup metaphor is fun. So I think now we'll do Q's and A's.
Okay.
All right.
Elliott and I are going to switch places for the rest
I'll
of
do
the, there we go, the rest of the session this morning. And I'm going to turn to Amy Walter first. Amy and her team at the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter are writing about polls virtually every week. And I wonder how you've reacted to Elliott's book and what some of your big concerns are about the polling profession today.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I've always been such a big fan of yours as well. And I think we owe a debt of gratitude to everything Carlin has done over the course of her career in helping to raise these issues into the public consciousness and among political professionals, reporters. So thank you. And I'm also hungry, so thanks for that, Elliott. Now I really, really want tomato soup. What I enjoy about this book is it really answers the fundamental question of, well, are polls broken? And your answer would be, well, they've never been not broken, right? It's that they're fundamentally, we have expectations for them that are outsized, right? That going all the way back, you're pointing to, in the book, through various parts of history, the challenges that different pollsters or statisticians, people who were innovators in this field would come up on. They thought they found the perfect solution, only to find 2 or 4 years later, like your FDR example, or George Gallup, who found that, yes, it's great if you could interview a whole lot of people, but human beings like to interview people that look and act a lot like them, right? Mm-hmm. So you got a lot more educated. If you're a white educated person, you're gonna hang out in those neighborhoods. You're not gonna hang out in diverse neighborhoods. You're not gonna talk to people that don't look like you. Or you're gonna assume things about people because you interviewed one of them as opposed to 50 of them. So it's never been a perfect science. And it seems to me what's happened, especially over the last 10 or so years, or maybe we can even say as the internet has become more important and Twitter has become more important in our political dialogue, that our expectations for polls are higher than they should be. And what consumers expect from polling is higher than it should be, which you also address in this. This is the line that is a hard one, and I think, so I have a number of questions for you, but to me, the fundamental question is, as you said, the best fix is for polling, you say, may lay in part on lowering our expectations for them, which it seems like we've kind of got beyond that now, right? That's a little bit like saying the horse is not just out of the barn, but the horse is way down the track. The idea that we're going to be able to bring that horse back and say, well, just kidding. These polls have been wrong the whole time, right? Or lower your expectations for them, even as people have built entire business models based on whether it's the accuracy or the idea that you can aggregate enough polls or you can put enough of these predictive models together to give people a strong sense that they're going to get what they see. So that's question number one. How do we actually go to either lowering expectations of consumers, of journalists, and of course the people, the normal people that consume polls, which was not the case when Selinda and I were doing this, and Carlin too, in the 90s, right? People weren't consuming polls who weren't in the business. Now everybody can type 538.com and get their fix. The other question that I have is sort of a more cynical look at polling, more cynical than even this. I mean, I can go deep cynical. We've only just scratched the surface.
We've all practiced the deep cynicism recently.
Because I want them to work too. Let me start by saying that. I do want them to work, and I do think that they work, and I think your premise is correct, that without them, all we have then are hot takes, right? We don't need any more hot takes. We have enough of them already. Even the best reporter in the world who goes and knocks on as many doors as they possibly can is never going to be able to get the full range of opinion that a survey can get. So I do want them to work. I want people to appreciate and understand them. And I do think, yes, it's important for people in the business of public service to understand where the public is coming from, whether that changes their mind or not. But this goes to my cynicism part, because let me find this quote, which I thought was very good, about, how important polls are to helping politicians. Oh, okay. How important they are in helping people who are in the business of public policy understand what the public wants. So you said the polls serve as one of the public's few corrective tools, and it's sort of a populism of public opinion, right? Leaders tend to change course when their approval ratings dip or continue on course when they soar. But if you think about the kinds of institutions or industries that can afford to do polling, how much are we talking about policy that people are actually interested in, and how much are we really getting into the public discourse, the kinds of conversations that people who can afford to do the policy research want us to be having? This is the fundamental disconnect, it seems, in our politics right now is you get voters saying, nobody in Washington's talking about anything that interests me. I don't understand why they keep talking about X or Y. Politicians say, you're right, we're going to talk about X or Y. You've been ignored for too long. And somehow there continues to be this disconnect. So can polling fix that, or is it just, again, inherent in the challenge of who can put those issues into the public discourse? And the other thing I would love for all of us to dig into, especially our pollsters on the panel, is this question of, which you bring up in the book as well, low trust in institutions writ large, which include people that will try to contact you to fill out a survey, whether they're contacting you on the phone, online, through the mail. Is there any difference between the kind of person who is willing to fill out a survey and the kind of person who isn't willing to fill out a survey? It seems like that's what we learned in 2020, and which goes to this issue you brought up a little bit earlier, Elliott, about a non-response bias. Who are these people that aren't answering polls, and are they all one type of person, right? We assumed after 2020 that I guess everybody who didn't respond to polls were Trump supporters. So the pollsters must have gotten that white rural vote wrong, until we go back through the data and find, well, actually, Trump did pretty well, and he did as better than many Republicans had ever done in big cities. Did really well in overwhelmingly Hispanic border communities or in South Florida. So it wasn't just, oh, we didn't get enough white non-college. It was much broader than that. So the kind of person who is hard to get in the polling. And then finally, the question I'd love for all of us to answer is, how much responsibility is there for the people who cover polls, for the people who do the polls, people who talk about the polls, to help consumers be better at consuming these polls? And that we get away from, I know there's always a complaint, there's too much horse race journalism, there's too much horse race journalism. People like horse race journalism. It's gonna not go away. So let's just, again, that's a little, the horse is gone out. But I think people wanna understand and appreciate what things should they look for as they are seeing the information. What's a better way as you are looking at this data to say, what is this actually telling me? Rather than just so-and-so's up by 2 points. What does that mean? Doesn't really mean anything right now in a vacuum. But I can look at what other factors can we look to, whether they're in polls or other data that is out there to help make people smarter about this. So.
Elliott is writing down all these wonderful questions.
Yes,
and so
sorry
we're
about
going
that.
to turn to Dan Cox next. Dan heads the new AI Survey Center in American Life, and he's really doing some wonderful in-depth polling on very significant issues, and we're very grateful to have him at AI. Dan?
Thanks, Carlin, and I'm grateful for Elliott for writing the book, for all of us gathering here. I think Elliott's book does a tremendous job in helping us kind of recalibrate expectations about what polling can and can't do. I think we've kind of dangerously vacillated between, after the 2008 election, there's nothing that polls can't do. We should be asking questions about everything. To post 2020, then you have we're inundated with articles about often by the same reporters who are saying, well, polling is completely broken, don't trust it. And obviously, the truth is in kind of the messy middle. And I think, again, this book really helps lay out the case of both the promise of polls, why they're important, and some of the limitations, which I think are inherent in any research methodology. But we seem to be really focused on polling because that's where a lot of the public interest lies, right? We don't, think about focus group methodology or in-depth interviewing, right? It doesn't receive the same kind of scrutiny as polling does, and I think appropriately because polling is sort of become kind of the de facto way that we quantify so many aspects of American public life. And the work that I do is, I do some politics. My background is in political science, kind of, sort of, but most of the work I do is around religion and culture and trying to tease out, what Americans care about and the experiences they have and what have you. But I agree with a lot of what Amy says in terms of there's not an alternative to polling, right? There's really, we should all be on the side of let's make polling work as well as it can and just make it better. And I think part of that process is being transparent about what we're doing and why we're doing it. I really appreciate APOR's Transparency Initiative for that reason. So working on getting the new center bought in, but we are already releasing all our data publicly, so it's part of that process where we can have conversations about what we're doing, open ourselves to criticism about what we're doing wrong, and take whatever steps necessary to make it as good as it can be, because we need it. And I think I'm just going to touch on a couple things that I think that we as a sort of polling community can focus on and have a conversation about maybe some correctives. So one is the issue of uncertainty, which Elliott addresses in the book. I want to focus less on uncertainty around, due to sort of sampling variation and biases, and more on the actual opinions themselves. So the same person you interview today may not have the same opinion in a year from now. You ask questions a little bit differently, they may answer them differently. And a lot of that has to do with ambivalence or apathy or maybe even ignorance. And I think a lot of our polls don't capture that. I mean, I'm certainly guilty of this myself. I've never included in a press release, X% of people have never heard about this issue or have no opinion about something, right? And I have rarely seen reporters cover that kind of data too, but that's the non-opinion is really important too. And we ought to do a better job of communicating that. And that just goes to the second thing I want to talk about quickly. Elliott mentions it in the book, the handoff, right, between the pollster and the reporter or other consumers of polling data, and how it's a really important relationship. I've been working with reporters for over 15 years, and 201, I think they're always interested in getting it right. But I do think there's issues on both sides in terms of incentives. My goal for the work that I do is I want people to read it. I want people to read and understand my work, and journalism and reporters is one way to do that. But to do that, I've got to kind of make things exciting. I've got to boil down a survey of 50 questions asked to 5,000 people to a couple sentences and maybe a single number. And I think a lot of the problem is we lose a lot of the nuance and the context around that. And I would love to see, and I think we are seeing, particularly around election polling, more contextualizing, which I think is just really, really important. So I'll stop there, but I would love to sort of dig into that aspect of it, particularly how can the relationships between reporters and pollsters, which is absolutely symbiotic, be improved in a way that sort of helps us both.
Thanks very much, Dan. To you, Selinda.
Thank you, and I want to thank you for your leadership in this panel. I love the book. It's so readable, by the way. And I'm really honored to be panelists with these other panelists. So I have a little bit, it's like the minestrone. I have a little bit of things to say about a couple of things. First of all, I told Amy I was going to start this way, that what I think is really ironic is the other people that I think are in a similar field to our field are the weathermen and women. And my favorite quote about the weathermen and women is a cartoon that was done by a sixth grader, who said, doesn't the weatherman have a window in his office? So, we think of nothing of something that says, as Amy was saying earlier to me, 70% rain and we don't get rain. But the pollsters say 70% chance that Hillary's going to win, and we're all critiquing the pollsters. So I think Dan really provides, this book, I'm sorry, Dan Elliott really provides Dan does too, some perspective on this. The first thing I'd say, and I love the analogy, I love two things about the book. I love the fact that it talks about bringing democracy and the voices of the people to the table. And that is something that in our firm we have always taken very, very, very seriously. But I also think that some of the cynicism around polling, and particularly for the young people in the audience, because I see a lot of young faces, is people, rightly so, don't want their leadership to take their positions from polling. And we actually don't work for people who do that. When I was first starting my business, we had a U.S. Senator come and talk to us about polling on the Iraq War. And we were a firm solidly opposed to going into the Iraq War. And I said, I'm deeply honored. It would have been my first U.S. Senator out on my own. But I said, I think it's immoral to poll on a war for your position. I would be glad to poll on how you talk about your position, but I don't think it's a good fit for us. And one of the things that people in our business tease me a lot about is how could you be AOC and Joe Biden's pollster at the same time? And you may have that same question, and I'd be glad to give that answer. But the point is, we work for people who know what they believe. They don't take their positions from the polling. And we've always worked, since our conception, only for pro-choice candidates. We don't ask you to wear a scarlet A on your forehead, although now I would ask that. But we just never, and that included funding for low-income women. So we have been a polling firm with a point of view. We have also been one of the polling firms that has been the most often worked with Republican polling firms. And in fact, even wrote a book on women voters with Kellyanne Conway, which I'm very, very proud of that book and very proud of that partnership. And the thing about it is that, first of all, I would say that 80% of the polling that's done by people like us who work for candidates, et cetera, isn't public.
That's right.
It's private polling. And there's a huge range of quality in the public polling.
Yes.
There's really, really fine polling like Dan does, and it really is good polling. Very, very serious methodologically. And then there's Channel 8 in Livingston, Montana, my hometown, that decides, well, we do marketing polling, we can do a political poll too, and that'll get us a lot of eyeballs. And they may or may not have a very serious methodology. They may do a poll on one day, they may not care much about how they're sampling that soup. So there's an enormous, enormous range in the quality of the polls that you see publicly. And I just want to lay that out. And one of the things that Elliott's book does is it gives you some of the criteria for looking at polls to figure out whether that is a good poll or not. Polling has definitely, I don't know if polling is in collapse, but it has certainly gotten significantly more difficult. It is very, very hard to reach people now, and a lot of people don't agree to do polls, even if they are reached. A lot of people break my heart by constantly telling me, well, Selinda, they mean it as friendly information. I never answer my phone if I don't recognize the name. Right. And it's like, you're killing me here. And do you answer it if it says research or polling? Because we have our calls preceded with that. And they go, no, not if I don't recognize it. And I said, well, then you're never going to get your opinion heard in a poll. So it's very difficult to reach people. And so there are real challenges in our field. And no good pollster would ever ignore that. One of the tips that Elliott gives in his book, which is a tip that we employ a lot, is using mixed methodology, trying to reach you in a variety of ways: landline, cell phone, text online panel, and mixing those methodologies up. It is more expensive, it is more accurate, and one of the problems we have, and I loved, Amy, your point about, think about who has money to pay for polls. the other aspect of that is a lot of our clients don't want to spend the extra money because they don't know, they don't realize how much more accurate that kind of mixed methodology is. We also have, I think there's been a lot of exploration of the polls in the last couple of years, and we've become much more aware of points that Dan and Amy raised and that the book raises of controlling for non-response, who answers and who doesn't. And we had a brand new factor in 2020. We've never had a voice as powerful as Donald Trump saying, don't answer the polls. And it did affect our response rates. And we actually early on controlled for that, but it was a real new factor for us to have that. There are differences a lot, and several people have mentioned the panel by education. And we stratify our samples by education. There's a real difference by activism, and I will give you a secret tip right now. Watch the polls right now. Activist Democrats are so upset about Roe v. Wade and gun violence that they are answering the polls. They are eager to answer the polls. And so it's not just that we're getting overrepresentation of Democrats, we're getting overrepresentation of activist Democrats, a very particular kind of Democrat. And Dan raised a very, very important question. Look to see whether that poll offers, or are you undecided, or do you not have an opinion yet on this? Very often, polls are asking the most technical questions about Ukraine and stuff like that, and not offering the do not know. And people, a good interviewer, everybody wants to get an A, right? You don't want to do the poll and then fail it. And a good interviewer will encourage you to do the poll. And so you make up your opinion. I don't want to disappoint you, and I don't want to look ignorant, but I have no idea where Ukraine is. And so look for non-opinion as well. The hardest thing one of the things that we used to use as a solution, and I'm in love with 538 too, as well as the Cook Report, was to look at the averages of the polls. Right. And that is a very, very good technique. Here's one problem with the averages. They're good as long as everything is kind of rolling along, but the averages, the single biggest challenge the averages have, and 538 just wrote something very, very good on this, is how to deal with new data. How do you deal with a major intervention effect, like the Supreme Court decisions, if you're averaging, because averaging washes out that intervention effect, that new data. So one of the biggest challenges is how do we handle a new event, a new data? Do we weight it extra in the average? Do we report it separately? That's a real challenge. Let me also say as a pollster, and we were the first ones, APOR's been great in terms of the Transparency Initiative, in terms of the Accuracy Initiative, and Ed Goa is a Republican pollster, and we were the first two firms to sign on to the APOR guidelines condemning the push polls. Not that you can't campaign the way you want to, but let's not call it a poll. So there are a whole ton of things that are presented out there as polls that aren't polls. Push polls where they're telling you that candidate X murdered their wife twice, once was not good enough. That's not a poll, that's a push poll. Then how are you gonna vote? All those online surveys that ask you for money at the end, pick your favorite issue for the congressperson to deal with and then tell us what's your biggest agenda. That's not a poll. The utility company calling you and wanting to tell you about their new clean energy initiative and then asking you, do you want to sign up for PEPCO's new Clean Energy Commission? That's not a poll. So there's a lot of stuff out there wildly inaccurate that is not polling that gets to call itself polling. Finally, I would say that the polling is very, very valuable in terms of bringing democracy to the table, but it can also be really used and abused. Some of the things that distress us about polling, and again, remember 85% of our polls are not public. I would be very, very happy to have an initiative like a number of countries have, of course it's against free speech, that would say, 2 weeks before an election, you can't release any polling. Because it does influence turnout. It does influence momentum in different races. It influences your money. I think we ought to have public financing. I think that's a whole nother panel. And I think probably many in the audience agree with me on having campaign finance reform. I'm saying this as an individual, not AEI. But having said that, I think that this is just yet another problem in the financing system that we have, that money follows money, money follows winners. And it hurts the chances of new voices, less money voices being brought to the table, the use and abuse of polling by donors. And then I'm really struck, and I want to underscore, because I've often said I wish I could win the lottery and then create $1 million pool to give away polling to local groups that never have the money to poll. That would be if I could do that, that would be my dream come true. Because the institutions that have money are very, very different. We, for example, you're probably getting a sense that we're a pretty progressive firm. We're one of the the only major Democratic firm that does not poll for pharma. We poll against pharma, the consortium of drug companies, because we want to lower prescription drug prices. We polled it was a big scandal, and I won't name the firm, of a firm that worked against the Amazon workers for Amazon. We worked for the Amazon. We were at that point the pollsters for the Amazon workers. But I will say, the last thing I will say is, even though we bring a point of view to our work and a sense of real commitment, and I would say this, I think most pollsters are very committed to accuracy.
Yes.
And also, if I'm polling for Amy and I tell her she's going to win and she loses, I don't work again. If I tell her she's going to lose and she loses, she may be mad at me and say, why couldn't you figure out that how I could win? But I get to work again. So there's no incentive for the legitimate pollsters to be inaccurate. In fact, there's every incentive for us to be accurate. And it's very hard to do in this world. But I love Strength in Numbers, and I think it's a great read. I think it's a great beach read too. So August vacation. And everybody on the beach will think you're an interesting nerd.
Or a nerd. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Selinda. I think our panelists just put some wonderful questions on the table, and we're going to turn to Elliott to answer some of them, and then I have a few of my own if we have time. But I want all of you in the audience to be thinking about your questions. We're going to leave time for them at about 12 o'clock. We finish at 12:15. Elliott, your response to what you've heard thus far.
Well, first off, these are great questions. So I've never written a book before, but when one writes a book, you don't really know who's going to read it. You don't know what type of feedback you're going to get. You don't know. We've had fact checks, but you don't know if people are going to hate it or disagree with it. This is a really good panel though, because all of y'all are engaged with polls in different ways, but you're engaged with them, and so these are really good questions. And so thank you for that. I've spotted a few threads tying these questions together, and I think the biggest one is, I'll say first, the book does not argue for what the political scientist Sidney Verba called government by survey. That is a bad idea, and the book is pretty straightforward about that. And it's because of all of these sources of uncertainty. It's because of it's not just uncertainty from sampling error, from drawing the wrong spoonful of soup, but also question wording problems, problems defining groups of voters or likely voters, not being able to reach certain populations. And so all of those pressures mean when you take a poll, it could be off by X% or whatever. That's what pollsters call their margin of error. That margin of error could be 2 times as big as the one you hear about if it's an election poll, researchers have found. And so you really don't want to anchor democracy through the reading of every single poll. I'll put that forward first. And another reason you don't want to do that is because not all pollsters, not all people in the press are wedded to accuracy and to elevating the voice of the people, of the majority, or however we want to define the criteria for making democratic decisions. So that comes in on Dan's question about how pollsters should work with the press. I think Dan does this really well because he works as a pollster, as a researcher. I mean, polling is a scientific process. Every single poll is not just like you run it overnight and you come up with an estimate and you publish it, right? It's like an academic project. Pollsters have to research their weighting benchmarks. They have to triple check their methods for talking to the public, and all that work happens before you even see the actual poll. And there's potential for error on all those on all the stages in that process. And when you engage with polling as a researcher and you write your reports as a researcher, that comes through. But when you write up your poll as a political consultant first and not as a researcher first, at least in my experience consuming polls, then you lose some of that nuance. Right. Not to say we shouldn't do political partisan polling. And I'll actually I have a point on that too, which we'll get to. But to say that honesty with the reporter, I think is something lots of reporters miss when they're reporting on polls. I see people in the press all the time also just basically blog about a report that they see without talking to a pollster first. So they're missing even more context about how that number was generated, about all the sources of uncertainty or whatever. And maybe they're missing clear signs of bias too about these questions. Are you weighting by education if we're in 2016? Maybe if you're in 1948, are you like weighting by whether or not you own a telephone or a car, which is a story in the book? Or in 2020, are you weighting by whether or not you're a Republican or a Democrat, or your voting behavior, your participation, or whichever? I mean, some pollsters are weighting by 13 different variables now, which is just speaking to the sheer problem of the non-response in the surveys. So it's incumbent on pollsters partially to engage that conversation, but also on the reporters. If they're reporting on surveys, reporting on a scientific process, to treat their reporting like they would reporting on any other academic article, essentially, which is what polling is at this point. And so one thing that's interesting, you have like poll correspondents at newspapers now. And Politico, and some of them do election forecasting, but lots of them just report on polls. And CNN is particularly good on this and having pollsters. Fox News also has pollsters, and they have a separate election forecasting department too, but that's separate. Neither here nor there. And those people tend to produce good journalism about the polls. It's the other people. It's anchors and some of those networks presenting that information without the context, but also in any slew of online first outlets that don't have traditional polling reporters there and are reporting, new poll says Democrats are up X%. Wow, that is not an article you want to write. That is the fault of the reporters, not necessarily a problem inherent in polling. They would presumably also report on an analysis of voter file data or like a report from a campaign spokesperson or something in a similar way. So I view that as sort of the secondary issue, not necessarily a problem with polling. But there are some. And then I'll just say before I move on, if pollsters are acting as researchers, they're also tending to emphasize these non-attitudes that people might have. And again, Dan does that pretty well. When in my capacity at The Economist, I work with YouGov. When we report on YouGov surveys, we always include the don't know percentage in our graphics, which I think is key. Most people don't actually read the story. They see the graphics online and they move on or what have you. And I think, again, though, that's sort of on the poll reporters. So one thing I want this book to do is sort of reset a bit our conversation in the press about polls. And that's a pretty lofty goal, but maybe we can make some progress there. I think I'll say before moving to open questions, this problem of whether polls are elevating the actual concerns of the people or elites' concerns is not addressed in the book, and is a really good point. To the extent that polls are missing what Americans actually need from their government. I'm thinking they would be doing that in a variety of ways. First, that the people answering the polls are politically engaged, so they're already very politically engaged. So pollsters are currently waiting on whether or not you are correcting their surveys to be representative based on whether or not you've engaged in political campaigning recently, your degree of volunteering, in other terms, to try to make sure they're representing people who aren't turning into the news 24/7. That's also a pretty hard problem to solve because you don't really know the true percentages of the disengaged population. So again, we can have that introduces uncertainty in other ways also. So that's one way that polls just inherently wouldn't necessarily be representative of all the Americans they're trying to talk to. One prescription at the end of the book is to have interest groups that are polling interest groups that serve almost exclusively to elevate the voice of the people, the percentages that they generate, hopefully with really good research and honest researcher orientation to reporting on their polls. And that might help. I mean, tying their funding streams directly to accuracy, to whether or not they're serving the public good. I mean, the Pew Research Center does this already, but mainly in their capacity as a pollster, or almost entirely in their capacity as a pollster because they're not an interest group. But you can imagine pollsters that send their reports to Capitol Hill, that have lobbyists lobbying. That might be a pollster. Lobbying,
Take the call. It might be a
That phone
pollster.
that says polling or research.
lobbying entirely for the will of the majority in their polls, or again, whatever decision criteria we want. And that could help a little, but that's worth thinking about. That's a good point. And not something that the book really says anything about. And I'm wary of our time. The last quick thing is that the book is, I think, a love letter to polls in a sense. That could blind it to some things. But really, what I want people to do is think about polling as an input. If you can imagine, I'm a modeler, so I'm imagining democracy as something that has outputs like government policy, government statements, whatever, and inputs. And polling, I think, should be one of those. I think we've moved too far in the direction of treating that input as too precise in the pre-election polling world, and that hurts it in the issue polling world. And that's the imbalance that I want to correct. I mean, one anecdote, if we're trying to assign, I guess, blame for that, I do think you have to look at how polls have been reported on in their election forecasting context over the past decade and a half.
I agree.
Interestingly, APOR sort of warned us all about this in 2007. They said, be really careful with your election forecasts. Sure you treat uncertainty properly. This might rewire how people think about polls. I think they were demonstrably correct.
Yeah.
And so I think if we move back in the other direction, that's what the book is arguing. I mean, the final metaphor is that polls, we are treating them as measurements of the pulse of democracy. That's George Gallup's and his research assistant Saul Forbes' famous statement in 1940 when they're basically unveiling this tracking tool for American democracy. I think it's too scientific, not to be grandiose or to be too full of puffery for the book, but I think a better metaphor is just the mirror. You're staring into polls to get a rough image of what everyone else, what the body politic thinks. And that's really all it does. It's not a pulse oximeter to measure your press. It's not scientific. It's scientific, but it's not as scientific and straightforward as measuring your pulse, but also a pretty artful science. So that's the message I want people to take away from it.
Yeah.
We have some terrific questions from our online audience, and I'm going to try to pull some of these together. A couple of them are for Elliott, and a few of them are for specific panelists. But Elliott, given the changes that have occurred in polling in the past few years, for example, increased participation from activist Dems, how is the nature of polling going to change in the future, and what do pollsters have to do to prepare for that? And then a second, somewhat related question, what are your solutions to low response rates? Have you heard of any exciting research that's looking at probability internet sampling, or separately, do you see anyone doing in-person polling this year if they have the money?
So I haven't heard anything about in-person polling. I'm sure there's panels at APOR that have talked about it. To the extent that I have ideas about how to fix polling, right? It's like from researching or reading the research on this, so I'm not attributing them to myself. As now I'm putting back on my like polling reporter hat. The things pollsters are trying after 2020 to get balanced samples of Democrats and Republicans, and along the sort of political engagement and ideological spectrums, as well as to move back from the like hyper statistical, let's weight all of the issues in our data out of this problem back toward the design phase of the poll, to make sure they have good, high quality interviews and respondents, to have higher response rates for their polls. So Pew has mail surveys with 28-30% response rates now compared to online polls. They get 5%, other people get closer to 1%. If you're a robocaller, you get like 0.5% or something, depending on how you do it. And so that's promising because it naturally increases the quality of the sample and sort of decreases the errors that could be due toward this because of the statistical algorithms or whatever other problems you might have with the poll. So that's promising. And I mean, it's sort of we don't know how well it's going to work until it works out well, or works out poorly in the next election, or along what other X or Y benchmarks that pollsters have for how accurate their data are besides election outcomes. But the sort of tests they're doing are promising. So that's one way they're trying to do that.
Okay. Question for the whole panel. How has the rise of big data disrupted public opinion business?
Oh, I don't think it's disrupted it. I think it's complemented it. I think maybe it was disruptive initially in the sense that some people said, well, let's just abandon the polls and let's just bring on big data. And big data has its own problems. And big data is like the analysis of huge data sets or patterns in huge data or modeling and all of that kind of stuff. There's some talk particularly in the reflection of the Obama campaign of how they used big data. And I think they did it quite well. They always melded it together, and there's a very interesting conversation in the book about that. But I think that's readjusted, and now I think that people use big data and polling data in complement. I think they do different things. Often the polling data is now put into the data sets for big data. So if we're working with a big data analysis on a campaign, we'll send over all of the polling data, including the response rates, to the modelers, the big data analysts. So I don't think it's disruptive. I think it's a complement. And when you're trying to get accurate and you're trying to get validity, I think it also does different things. Just like polling has to be more rigorous in its methodology, I think there's a broad range of methodology in the big data too. And I think there is some big data analysis that needs to get more rigorous in its analysis as well. So sometimes, mainly driven by cost and what clients will pay for, big data will take the first person they get on the phone. Or they just take, I'm going to get 5,000 interviews, I'm going to get them with the very first people that answer, and that gives you an older, more female, more activist sample, more college-educated sample. So I think there needs to be more rigor in methodology and some of the same exploration in big data. Big data sometimes, although I rarely hear that now, and Elliott, I'd be interested in your conversations, and Amy, I know you're in constant dialogue. It used to be in the very early days, some big data analysts would say, well, we have such big numbers, we don't have to worry about the methodology. The numbers will take care of it. Well, the numbers don't take care of it. You still have to worry about methodology. But I don't hear that anymore.
Yeah.
And so I think the two complement each other. I think they're facing similar problems, and I think they reinforce each other's accuracy, and the same kinds of exploration that pollsters are doing about improving their methodology, big data is doing as well.
Do we have some questions from the audience? All right, and we'll go to the back first. And if you could just state your name.
Hi, my name is Paul Huang. I'm from Taiwan, visiting here. I'm affiliated with Taiwanese Public Opinion Foundation. We are the most active public opinion polling organization in Taiwan. I just have a small comment about Mrs. Lake. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the one you mentioned an idea about banning the releases of opinion poll prior to the election. Was that, actually, we have that in Taiwan. I understand that in U.S. it's not possible because the First Amendment issued. In Taiwan, we do have this law. So 10 days before the election day, we cannot, or anyone else cannot. We can do that internally, but we cannot say or publish anything.
And what do you think? How do you think it works?
Well, for me personally, our experience has been that we think it's actually not necessary because in terms of transparency, in terms of the due process of the whole thing, politicians, political parties, they have their own way of interfering with that, of like going through that. They release that. They use rumors, they use chattering, social media to influence those. And the people that who are most susceptible to being influenced, they don't tend to read our polls anyway.
Yeah.
But for us, we think that being able to publish those polls before the elections would actually do good for the democracy.
Interesting. Thank you for your
There's
insight.
another question right up here. Oh, I'm sorry. No.
Hello, I work as a campaign staffer in Sweden, and we have been seeing a lot of polls right now, which are showing that environmental concerns are polling very high. At the same time, we aren't seeing voters really act on those concerns in how they are voting. My question to the panel is essentially how can we determine the revealed preferences of voters instead of just their stated preferences?
And there's a question in the back. We'll put a second question on the table. Or was that your question?
Well, similar, actually. I work at Third Way, and we do a lot of, my name is Eliza Astro, and we do a lot of issue polling at Third Way. So I wanted to ask, if you guys could talk a little bit about acquiescence bias and how we can be doing our issue polling a little bit better.
Yeah.
Okay. Dan, you want to start there?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the first questioner, it's about salience, right? Like that, so many of the polls that are conducted, it's all about what do you think about issue A, B, C. But what's missing in a lot of the analysis is like actually how much have you heard about it? How much do you care about it? And frequently, the answer is not much, right? Like if you look at even the high-profile issues like same-sex marriage during the 2010s forward, it was associated with the millennial generation, right? This is the generation that was really strongly behind it, but it wasn't a voting issue for a lot of those folks. So they supported it very, very strongly and still do, but it didn't translate into altering their political behavior. So I think that's kind of a big deal. When it comes to acquiescence bias, I think there's some research at APOR that suggested that the sort of agree, disagree, favor, oppose format is not always great. That a better approach is to actually put sort of two contrasting ideas or positions and have people pick which one. Then you can ask how strongly do you feel about that or not. But I think like that is pretty important. And I think Pew's actually done some, I see Scott Keeter over there, Pew's actually done some work on this and has published on it. But I think that's generally a pretty good approach.
I also think doing focus groups really helps you to get that sense, especially when it comes to salience. When you start talking to folks and you hear what they're raising on their own, and this was pretty clear earlier this year, and I would even argue into 2021, that the idea that inflation was transitory was not what voters were feeling. I mean, they were raising it like, I don't know, I went to the grocery store, things were like, it was like $20 more than it was last week. Chicken breasts are $14, right? If you start picking that up over and over again, it's like, it doesn't matter what the polls are saying people are talking about, right? But what they're feeling in their day-to-day life. So yes, they may believe that. Is the environment your number one concern? Absolutely. What are you dealing with today? Well, I couldn't fill up my car because that was too expensive. And I'm really worried once school begins, like, how are we going to manage all of this? Because I got to drive the kids to the thing and the blah. That's what's taking up 90% of the time. So I'd love to be able to vote on the environment, but I can't. That's not where my day-to-day life is situated right now.
You kind of wonder how the Federal Reserve would have responded if they were looking at the polls on inflation.
Yeah, I mean, people
Totally.
were feeling it early on, before we started to see the spike in gas prices. And it is it's both a good warning system as to what people are talking about, and then how they're talking about it. Even on abortion, what I've picked up in these groups is that, yes, the issue of what it means to be able to have access to reproductive care is key. But this is especially true with younger, sort of Democratic-leaning voters, voters of color. Where they go almost immediately is, what's next, right? Are we going to reverse these bans on or reintroduce bans on interracial marriage? Are we going to start banning same-sex marriage? Are we going to ban contraceptive? And it also brings men into the conversation, because when the conversation was almost solely about what does it mean to have abortion access, and the women were speaking, the men kept saying, like, well, this isn't really my issue. I'll defer to the women in the group. Like, it's their thing. I agree with them, but I'm not going to speak. As opposed to, once you start getting into these other issues, it was a much more holistic way of thinking it. So even when we're asking the question, is it abortion access important to you? I think it's missing a lot of the nuance, which is, it's not really about abortion. It's about this idea that everything is going back for these voters. Things are going backwards. How are we in 2022 and we're talking about stuff that we thought was solved, if not 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago? Where is it going to end?
Can I say one thing on acquiescence bias?
Sure, of course.
So 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Economist partners with YouGov for surveys. We had YouGov run an experiment on their panel, where instead of asking 1,500 people 5 different questions, each one saying, do you prefer or do you favor or oppose policy legalizing abortion in most or all scenarios, and then do you favor or oppose it for emergency healthcare for women, et cetera? Instead of asking those questions separately, asking if you favor or oppose, they asked them in a grid to have people select which policy they favored. And across all of the different combinations, whether or not they were liberal or conservative, they found a 5 percentage point acquiescence bias in the favor or oppose format. So that means the policies that they were finding had like 55% support in the favor or oppose question, may be less in the grid question. Now, we don't really know the truth. We might think that, because people are more likely to say yes for these other research reasons, we should use the grid format, but the truth could be somewhere in between. But that's the way we've contributed to that.
There's a question right in the back, and then in the front, we'll take these 2 questions.
Thank you. Leon Peace. My question, I've never been polled, and I asked this question last night. How do I go about getting polled? Any particular strategies?
And could we put this question on the table too? I'm sorry. No? Okay.
It's good to see you here as well as at Politics and Press last night.
I think did you have a question up here? Yeah.
I'm
he
sorry.
did,
Oh,
yeah.
all right. We missed that one over here. Please, let's put this question on the table too. So we have just a few more minutes.
All right, my name is Dario Soato. I'm a high school student from Southern California. So one of the panelists mentioned that during the 2020 election, Trump's exhorting of his supporters not to answer the polls added a new complexity to the polling landscape. So I was wondering whether you see this as a problem going forward, and if so, how that's going to affect both the polling industry and, by extension, the results of elections.
So if you want to be selected for a poll, you can answer every phone call you get, I guess, which might be kind of toxic with the spam environment. You can also go online and sign up for online non-probability panels yourself. So if you go to yougov.com, you can sign up and take their surveys. Now, you might not always get all of their surveys. They'll only select you when they need responses from someone with your demographics. So that's how they select their sample. But that's one way. That's one way you could do it. I guess you could go to colleges and maybe sign up for face-to-face surveys too. But I think there's a selection process. So if they're picking 1,000 people out of 350 million every single day, your odds are pretty low. But yeah, you can sign up.
Yeah, the other thing you can be is you can be a registered voter.
Yes.
And you probably are, but a registered voter and a primary voter.
Right.
Then you're going to up significantly your chances of getting called.
Yep, and vote in all of those elections.
Yes, and vote in
And
all
even
those
more so,
elections.
vote in every single election. You're going to get a lot of calls. And live in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
How about that? Okay.
Thinking back to your question, I remember, and this will show you how old I am, I think it was the Gary Hart primary in Chicago. Was it Mike Royko who told the public to lie to the pollsters?
Yeah.
He wrote a couple of great columns about that, and then 4 years later, he did the same thing. And so we've had some of these kinds of problems,
That's
but
true.
of the Trump problem overall.
So one of the things we do, and it was one of the practices we had adopted after 2016, is and I think most of the pollsters have adjusted now, but it used to be that when we couldn't get someone, we just replaced them with someone. Now we're much more careful. So for example, in our polling, even after 2016, we would replace a model Trump voter with a model Trump voter. And this is part of the advantage of merging big data and polling, because we have probabilities that you will be an X, Y, or Z. And so that's one of the ways, making sure that you don't allow those Trump voters. But it's still a big difference, right? I mean, you got the Trump voter who refused to be polled and the Trump voter who agreed to be polled. Could be pretty different in their attitude. So it's very, very challenging. We also have in our introductions, because a lot of people will refuse polls, not because Trump exhorted them to, but because they think this is going to be fundraising, this is going to be commercial. It's not really my opinion. I'd love to give my opinion, but it's not really my opinion. And so in our introduction, for example, we say, we are not going to sell you anything. We are not going to ask you for a contribution. We put it right up front. This is a public opinion poll. So those are some of the things that can be done. Dan may have some others.
Well, actually, I kind of want to just highlight something that Amy said, because I think it's incredibly important on the, if you're looking for the quote-unquote truth, you should really be looking at a variety of different methods. So focus groups can offer a lot.
Yeah.
There's this amazing report that was published, and I don't think it got much publicity, on abortion, and some academics interviewed like 200 different folks and using in-depth interviewing, right? So it wasn't just, check a box. And it paints a really different picture on American attitudes on abortion than the Pew report, and they're both right. But you come away with a very different conception of where the public is on these issues. And I think one of the things, and I've actually written on this, is that if you want to be an optimist, it actually shows that we're not as divided as we are. Is that a lot of the public opinion is really effective at kind of pushing us to either side, and then I think we get this impression that we're more polarized on some of these issues than we actually are.
Especially with responses from very politically engaged people who tend to be more partisan.
That point about Democrats. So are you suggesting then that the polling looks better for Democrats right now because the activists are more engaged?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're trying to control for it.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say, as we're trying to deal with acquiescence bias, and Dan revealed that forced choice, which is one of the great ways to deal with it. The problem is, lots of times, people in the middle simultaneously hold mutually contradictory views and usually deeply resent having it pointed out to
Yes.
them. And third way has
Yes.
been polling has
Yes.
been very good about revealing that.
Yes.
So in a poll we did with Ed Goaz, the Republican pollster on civility, we had 2/3 of the voters who said, I wish people would get together more and agree more and compromise more. And then 2/3 of the voters, so there was a significant overlap, saying, I want my elected officials to stand up for what they believe.
Exactly.
And so, and they didn't see anything contradictory with the
Nope.
two things. So I think that it's really challenging. One thing I would say, last thought I would give, is any pollster that is really behind the scenes is not relying on one question,
Yeah.
or any public pollster too, good ones. They don't rely on one question to determine the answer. And sometimes people will say, because the questionnaire is invariably too long, and they'll say, well, let's cut this question because you already asked that. And we constantly argue, we need to look for a pattern. We need to ask it more than one way. We've got to see the consistent attitude. So that's the other thing. It's a whole new book. But
Yes.
Elliott raised the question already. There is a big art to this, which is how the questions are worded, how you interpret those questions, what the question order is, that can make a huge, huge difference in your interpretation of the results.
Elliott, I want to congratulate you on the book and thank you for
Yes.
joining us today. And also thank you to the panel for a wonderful conversation.